you have to go and do the hard yards. I don't care who you are. Some people might be lucky and get an opportunity without the experience, but then you're going to not understand or be prepared for that moment.
It's a challenge, isn't it? Because they now have to move from one dressing room to the other, really. They walk across the corridor and suddenly now they're sat in the coach's office at like ridiculous times of the day, like 8:30 in the morning.
Unless you want to just go through it and spend all your time doing that. But 5 or 6 years on getting to the top level that you can, and a lot of people wouldn't get that far because you might not get accepted onto either your A licence or your pro licence. Most players don't get to 32, 33 and just go, I know exactly what I want to be, or, like without having experienced any of it. They might start coaching and really not enjoy it.
I think that's always been the thing. After a week, when you sit down and say, have you found it? And they go, just didn't realise how much work goes into being a coach.
Once you've got your job, it's the old classic, wasn't it? Well, you have to learn to drive one way, and once you've got your driving licence, you can do whatever you want.
Those players who come up to you and say, I'm thinking about becoming a coach. Has it ever crossed your mind that, no, that's not really a route you should go down? You're showing me none of the qualities as a player that you could be potentially a good coach.
Welcome, football fans, to Breaking Lines, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the beautiful game like never before. I'm Gary Rowett, former player and manager, joined by the insightful Dave Carolan, a man with his finger on the pulse of football's beating heart. Together, Dave and I bring you unrivaled insight, context, and a few stories from the trenches. This is Breaking Lines, where the game is more than just a match.
Well, Gary, one of the hardest transitions in the whole of football is when a player decides that they're going to move into coaching. And it's probably happened to a lot of players who've ended up becoming managers. How does that journey begin?
Yeah, I think it has to start, at that very moment when you realise. I think players are becoming far more aware of it now, aren't they? But whenever they're coming towards the end of their career, I think players are far better prepared, or at least starting to think about that a little bit earlier. Not all players are, but I think most. And the obvious part of that is, if you're coming towards a point where you think, okay, so maybe I've got a year or two left, can you pre-plan that move? I think you can prepare for it. I don't necessarily think you can pre-plan that opportunity, but I think you can prepare for it. And I think by what I mean by that is, and I say this to, I've had so many ex-players that have said, can I sit down for half an hour and just have a chat about it? And I've always said the same thing. The first thing, you've got an unbelievable opportunity, whoever you're working with, most players will have worked with 4 or 5 different groups of staff at the very least. Try to remember what it was that they did. Try to remember the structure of the week. Try to think about it in a little bit more detail. Try to think about the sessions that you did. Try to think about the sessions you liked, that you didn't like, that you thought were effective, but you didn't think were effective. Think about the teams and how they played, and just start to formulate some ideas and actually write down some ideas. So it gives you a bit of a starting point for, essentially a little bit of a framework. And then really there is no substitute, in my opinion. I've heard so many players say, yeah, I want to be a coach, or I want to be a manager. Like, great. Okay. So what experience have you got of that? Because that's the first thing that someone's going to say. So, you have to go and do the hard yards. I don't care who you are. Some people might be lucky and get an opportunity without the experience, but then you're going to not understand or be prepared for that moment. So you have to do some hard yards, in which case, I mean, do some coaching, whatever that is, your kids team, an academy team within the club that you're working with, any team that you can, because those first few sessions, you learn so much. I mean, that's the thing for me. I mean, I remember when I did my first academy I think it was like an under 12s group. And in my head, I planned this session. I had 12 balls. I had all the equipment in the world. I don't know what happened, but I thought that somehow I'd have my own equipment shed. So I formulated this session. And then I turned up for the session, and honestly, there was 3 balls. There was a limited number of bibs. It was really, really windy. And I learned there and then an absolutely valuable lesson that prepare for what's going to happen if things don't work. So look at your session and go, okay, what might stop this working? Not just, be perfect. So I think those hard yards are vitally important. And for me, that's the starting point for anybody, regardless of where and when that moment comes.
So have you ever, those players who come up to you and say, I'm thinking about becoming a coach, has it ever crossed your mind that, no, that's not really a route you should go down? You're showing me none of the qualities as a player that you could be potentially a good coach.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think at that point I probably had 3 or 4 years of brutal honesty with players, and maybe at that point I've avoided that moment. It's maybe it's just not for you. Yeah. So no, I think any sort of player towards the end of his career, I always say the same thing. You might not really know what you want to do. So for me, it's just dipping your toe into as many things as you can. Try and do a bit of media work. Try and do some coaching. Most of the players now have some form of business interest outside, whether that's a little bit of property or a little bit of a sort of side hustle, if you want, that they're just starting. So for me, you dip your toe into all of those things because it's very difficult. Most players don't get to 32, 33 and just go, I know exactly what I want to be, or, without having experienced any of it. They might start coaching and really not enjoy it. The inflexibility of it, the fact that you're starting out on very low money in comparison, well, everything's low money in comparison to what you probably earned as a player, but just very low money in general. People don't realize that, do they? But, how many players or how many people, forget the circumstances around it, how many people at, say, 34 would then go and work for 12 grand a year in something they've never done before? There's quite a few people that would find that a big challenge and maybe not in a position to do it. Of course, a lot of footballers maybe are in a position to be able to do that for a couple of years without the fear of not having enough money to pay the mortgage. So again, what circumstances you're in, some players don't want to do that, but ultimately I think there's no easy way of doing it. I think you have to start somewhere, and the start somewhere part for me is go and get some form of experience, because like you say, it might not be for you, but no, I haven't been honest enough to tell anyone this is not for you.
We've probably seen more and more players over the years, haven't we, starting in their mid-20s maybe, when they've had maybe a bit more of an established career, start to do their qualifications, haven't they? They've started doing their B license and their A license with UEFA or whatever the equivalent would be around the world, where they're essentially doing that, aren't they? They're starting to dip their toe into, do I like coaching? Do I want to go through this whole process to get to the level where essentially if you want to be a top end coach, you're going to have to do your pro license. But the journey to get into that obviously is multiple steps along the way, from your initial kind of grassroots coaching qualifications all the way up. So players are doing that, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think also, to caveat that, and I'll come back to the coaching qualification side of it, to caveat that, a lot of people, where once upon a time, if you wanted to stay in the game, it was to be a coach first and foremost. You had to go and coach. Absolutely. Now I think there's obviously other routes. A lot of people now would go straight from a player to, I want to be a sporting director. I don't see myself coaching. So they'll take the relevant steps to that. And obviously that's a little bit more tricky to try and get experience, because how do you do that? But I think the coaching route is pretty simple. You've got your badges. So if I look back, when I first started out as a coach, you didn't need to do your level 1. Level 1 was a sort of optional thing, really. You could do a fast track level 2 and level 3, I think, as an ex-player and whatever. So I did a residential 2 weeks, fast track 1 year, and then I had to go back the other year and do exactly the same. So it was kind of like quite a big 12-month commitment. Yeah. And also you had to do some hours in between that coaching. I think you've got to do something like 10 hours of coaching and 10 sessions. So again, once you start on that journey, you have to have experience, not just for your own sake of learning, but also to get the qualifications. That makes complete sense, right? And then after that, you're then going on to a different journey. Do you know what I mean? You're then going on to level 4, which is, of course, your A license. And then after that, you're going on to your pro license. So I think it's like any job, it should be. It's a very big commitment. You're talking about sort of 5 or 6 years probably unless you want to just go through it and spend all your time doing that. But 5 or 6 years on getting to the top level that you can, and a lot of people wouldn't get that far because you might not get accepted onto either your A license or your pro license because you probably need to be in a club at that point. Absolutely. But I think they're the steps, and I think that's right. I think any job you have to learn. It doesn't matter who you. Okay, as a footballer, to a certain degree, you understand your trade, you understand your craft a little bit, but then you have to understand how to put that into practice. How do people learn? The methodology of how to create sessions and how to make sessions, have parts in them where they challenge the players and you create those increased challenges. So I think it's really interesting, that process, and it is quite a strict process. Incidentally, I don't think we're the strictest process. I think if you look at, I think Holland is a very strict process. I think Germany is a very strict process, Italy as well. So that might tell you how they produce different types of coaches potentially. And you also have an option. It's quite interesting because I think some of the other organisations are a little bit quicker. So I believe Wales and Ireland are a little bit quicker in terms of, would that be Northern Ireland, Dave? I think that I'm not quite sure on which one.
It's Northern Ireland, yeah, but we'll cast no dispersions on them. But certainly a lot of players seem to vote with their feet for going for the Welsh FA and the Northern Ireland FA, and maybe there's a reason why they go along those ones. But I think you're right. When you look at certainly the English FA qualification is highly recognised for the challenge. Not everybody passes on the English FA or the German FA, and certainly the Spanish FA are absolutely stringent on making sure that you've done the work. You can't just pass off some sessions down with your mate's team, in the local park and say, like, just fill in my logbook for me, can you? They're actually making sure that you've done the work, that the coaching qualification is worth the weight of kind of the level that it is. And we've seen that as well with now FIFA bringing out the level 6 and level 7, where they're trying to say to people, there are going to be even higher standards of coaching and even around sporting directors and technical directors. So, I think you're right there. Yeah, I think players will probably try and find, on the whole, the easiest path, won't they? If they think it's going to get it done quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of those other organisations might be a tad more flexible, might be slightly, because they are expensive, the courses. I know sometimes you can get them partially funded, but and the PFA are brilliant in supporting that to try and help players upskill themselves. I think is fascinating as a union. But you're right, some of the other courses are maybe a tiny bit shorter, maybe more flexible. You might have more chance getting on them, for starters. But I think it's like anything. I used to hear so many people when I first started out trying to get qualified that would all say the same thing, that it's just a badge. Once you've got your drive, it's the old classic, wasn't it? Well, you have to learn to drive one way, and once you've got your driving license, you can do whatever you want.
Driving license,
and there's a little bit of that. I think, like, to a certain degree, I understand what people are saying, but I also think that's pretty lazy. And for me, the quality of those qualifications, and the quality of the work that goes into them, and also to give you an insight. Of course, it's only one part of the process of being a good and proficient coach, but I think it's an important part as well. So I'd certainly encourage anybody to go and, like I said before, you got to do the hard yards. You got to do the hours. If you want to be good at anything, you have to do the hours. You know what I mean? And I don't think coaching is any different at all.
We've seen some players now dip their toe in while they've been working with us over the years, haven't they? Trying to take steps and giving it a go as such, going behind the wheel for the first time. It's a challenge, isn't it? Because they now have to move from one dressing room to the other, really. They walk across the corridor and suddenly now they're sat in the coach's office at like ridiculous times of the day, like 8:30 in the morning, doing a planning meeting for the training session. And then the shock that goes across their face when they realise this isn't just cobbled together on the back of a fag packet, a couple of minutes before.
Isn't it? I never used a fag packet, but I've used a postage stamp before.
To be fair, my warm-ups just live in my head, but, generally speaking, I think that's always been the thing. After a week, when you sit down and say, have you found it? And they go, just didn't realize how much work goes into being a coach.
It's quite funny, isn't it, really? Because if you think to yourself, what on earth did they think? Because we have had that so many times, haven't we? But what on earth did they think?
What did you think?
But like, what did you think went into it? Do you just think that people? Well, no, actually, some of the managers that I work for, I genuinely think there wasn't a lot that went into it. I think they did write it on the back of a fag packet. But I think, if you see a week that's well structured, well organised, if there's some method to the madness of the sessions and why you're doing them, if there's planning around the games, I think if you're a player nowadays, surely you have to have a bit more of an understanding that this takes a lot of time to do. I mean, let's be really honest. Let's think about the clubs that we've been at. Most of the time, we'd be in the training ground for 7 o'clock, and most of the time you'd be I'd probably be leaving about 5 o'clock, Dave, and at times you'd probably still be there at about 8 o'clock. I'm not going to claim to work later than you because I don't think that's physically possible. But so yes, the players have been like, oh my God, I didn't realise this all happened. So I think it's a great, as a player, you just become I think it's changed a little bit, but you become in such a privileged position, you just don't realise you're in it when you're doing it. To bowl in at sort of like 9 o'clock for most of them, and to leave at, say, let's be ambitious here and say 2:30. At that point you go, that's a pretty damn good day for the pay that you get. And I know there's a lot of inflexibility around that, of course, and they've still got to live professionally away from, it doesn't stop when they go home, does it? It's not like you go home and just open a massive bag of Maltesers and, start chuffing beer down, do you know what I mean, at 2 in the afternoon. Well, some players have. That's okay for staff, but just not players. Yeah. So I think there is an element of that shock, isn't there? But also, I think it must be the hardest thing to do. And having seen it and experienced it and asked the player to do it, I think for a player to still play and try to almost start being a coach, because of course that's a natural thing, isn't it? You get to a point where a player's a little bit older, he's perhaps not playing as much, but can add so much value off the pitch. So for us, it's almost like, okay, how can we utilise that? Can we utilise that player within a few of those training sessions? Are they ambitious to be a coach? Can we give them a little bit of experience and see how they find it? And as you've alluded to, that first moment, you can think anything you want about that player's character and about that player's skill set, but there's nothing that I don't think I've ever seen so nerve-wracking from my perspective, as well as the coach's perspective, is that player doing his first session. Because I've seen some be fantastic and I've seen some be really, really awkward, because it's quite a different scenario, isn't it? Standing in front of your peers and telling them what to do. And some people are natural at it. So I think some people are just feel comfortable and some people don't. And we've witnessed a bit of both. It doesn't mean to say those people aren't now really, really good coaches, but I think that initial period is a really, really tough experience, isn't it?
Yeah, I in particular enjoy watching them kind of.
You horrible man. You're getting your own back here, aren't you? And all the stick.
Previous confidence that they had when they're battering your warm up has drained. As their mouth goes dry and they suddenly have to try, and you suddenly get that awkward bit when their voice goes up an octave when they try to say, "Right, boys, pass the ball." Oh, God. But
have you ever been tempted? Sorry to cut you short. Have you ever been tempted to give? I know it'd be a hard thing because you'd be killing me a little bit. Have you ever been tempted to give him a bit of stick on the sideline like you would get? Oh, not as easy.
100%. Oh, pass the ball. But yeah. You just sit there and then they start to realize, and that's one of the challenges, isn't it? You've got to get your voice as a coach. You've got to learn how to communicate and how to command and how to structure and all those kind of different ways of giving feedback that they have to go on that journey with. But that only comes through experience, doesn't it? They have to, you can do the qualifications, you can sit in the car with your driving instructor and he can tell you what to do and how to do it, and then one day you're out there on your own. You got to just get on with it. How do you think that What's the best way for those players to start? Is it by observing and being on the side and then dipping their toe into like a basic kind of passing drill? Is that the normal way, or do you give them other roles? Like, for example, do you get them go and work in the academy? Because we see in some countries that they start in the academy and actually go down to learn with the kids about how to coach before then putting themselves in front of the players. Or if a senior player said they want to come in, do it with the first team, do you give them that accommodation as well?
I think it's hard to accommodate people at that high level, that elite level. You have to know that they're capable of doing it to a certain degree. So I think that makes it a little bit challenging. I think ultimately, I think the ideal would be sort of twofold. One is that they get a chance to observe and spend a bit of time in the offices with the coaching staff, the analysis staff, the sports science staff, get a bit of an overview of how games are prepared for, both from a analytical point of view and a performance side, as well as that tactical side. So I think having a little bit of a insight into that is probably very, very valuable. And then I think the easiest thing, if I'm being honest, is probably to go and work at the younger ages in the academy, because I did that when I first started. I left Charlton, finished playing there early. I was captain in the Premier League, and then a month later I was coaching the under-14s at Derby. And it was so valuable. The experience that you had, you're in the academy system. You end up, if you're working in the academy, someone will say, right, someone's ill, can you go and do the under-10s tonight before you do the under-14s? You've got a whole pitch to yourself. You're going on an evening in the winter and you've got a quarter of a sports hall. Do you know what I mean? So it makes you think in a flexible way. It makes you have to learn quickly. You can make mistakes, because a 14-year-old or a 10-year-old really, maybe they will nowadays, but they're not really going to berate your session. So you need to then have that little bit of, feedback from how they do things, but also, that sort of overview yourself of, being a little bit critical of your own sessions and learning and evaluating. And I think that sets you up so that you're at least a capable coach, hopefully, by the time you eventually maybe do get to a first team. Or some people would just rather coach. I was just talking to an ex-player the other day who said, I'd rather just coach kids. I've got no real desire to coach. Yeah. His words were, I've been in a first team that long. I've got no desire to work with those players. I know what they're like. That's what he said. So, and I understand that, and I sort of get that. So, and you can be a brilliant coach. I think we don't do enough of it here. I think actually being an academy coach is not valued or paid enough, because most people then have a step-by-step approach to try and get to first team. But actually, we should keep. There are some people who are brilliant academy coaches, working development coaches, and actually should remain like that rather than work with the first team. So I think as a player, I think, like I said, doing the hours, learning the hard way, learning what works, learning what doesn't work. And for me, that was, I tried to view that as a full-time role rather than just turn up for an hour in the evening. I tried to view that as, I need to be as prepared as I can. I need to make sure there's variety in my session. I need to make sure the session gets out the learning points that I want to get out, maybe with a view to a game on a Saturday or a Sunday. So I think you have to be serious about it. But I think that gives you an opportunity to do that in at least a less pressured environment. Do you know what I mean? I think that's a key, isn't it? Where do you think it's worked best in your experience of seeing players take that transition? Have you seen many go straight from a player to either let's say a head coach or an assistant coach, and it been incredibly successful? Or on the whole, is it the players that have done the hard yards and built themselves up to that point? What I know there's no one rule, but what's been your experience?
Yeah, even in the last couple of weeks, in games I've been in the league, I've come up against two ex-players who've had completely different journeys to becoming very good head coaches. One who's finished at the top level and then gone into coaching at the top level straight away, and another who's ended up going through the academy route, of doing their time on task, working through the age groups, eventually getting up to, under 21s or under 23s, as it might have been. Then you suddenly get thrown into that kind of caretaker role, perhaps, if the club have made a change. And then you're almost by by osmosis getting the next stage all the time. You're kind of growing with the age levels of the players until eventually you're in and around a squad that potentially would have 5 or 6 players that they would have coached through the club. So it's not like they're going in brand new. I think if you're going to go straight in at the top in terms of coaching at the first team level, you have to have either a lot of credence in the bank as a player, or being incredibly ambitious in your coaching quite early to have gained the qualifications and the skills, because you're not going to survive too long at, as you say, first team level if you don't have the credentials straight away that the players are going to buy into your sessions or your knowledge or the content. If you've only got, say, a selection of 5 different passing drills, that you've used up in the first 2 weeks.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah, well, we graduated to 6 at the last club.
Do you think you can tell which players are going to be good coaches, or do you think there's people that maybe go under the radar? Do you know what I mean? But do you think most of the coaches that you've seen, could you tell as a player that they had the qualities? Like often it's a captain that you can see has that voice, has that personality. I know it's not all about that, but that's a good starting point, isn't it? Do you think you can tell?
I think you can see the difference between the ones who've got leadership qualities and others who've got good knowledge and good inquisitiveness around the process. I can think of a couple of ex-players who are now coaching or managing at a really high level, and they stood out as leaders, and they were going to go into that kind of role because they saw themselves as not going to say necessarily befitting of that role, but that was their expectation, that they would be first team orientated coaches or managers. But then I've also observed a lot of players who've come through because they had a love for the game in terms of they wanted to give something back, or they wanted to continue in the journey within football, and had decided that coaching was possibly going to be the way to do that. No ambitions to be a manager, no ambitions to be a head coach, but they wanted to be educators, really. And I think that's another side that we're now starting to see to the game, isn't it? That, not all of the top managers now were players who followed the player route into coaching, that they've come through the other one, where they've gone through education and they're maybe coach analysts, or they're just, almost professional coaches by trade. And that's a challenge to that old, well-worn path that the ex-player would have had to just jump in. No, we're going to need a coach at the end of the year, so we'll take one of the ex-players or the older players. Some of those routes are now not really open anymore, are they, for the coaches? Because if they don't do the qualifications, there's so many people who have done them, which means really those players who want to transition into becoming a coach are going to have to do that work even more so than before.
Yeah, I think you're seeing a rise in almost football academics, aren't you? That almost start at 18, 19, 20, go through that sort of university, maybe study performance first, so understand it a little bit, maybe then take a degree in football management or whatever that might be, or coaching, sport or whatever. There's so many different degrees now, isn't there, to do that?
Well, even the pro license is recognised as being the equivalent of a degree in football.
Yeah, absolutely. Does that mean I can put the names? Because I could put the letters before my names like other people do then. I've never thought about that. Usually other people put letters to my name rather than me allowed to do that. So, but I think you're right. I think there's a lot of career coaches that essentially start out without a game experience. And again, a little bit like the analogy I used earlier around the coaching courses. Another lazy thing, in my opinion, is how can you coach the game if you've never played it? I think that's absolute rubbish. I think there's people who've played it who cannot coach the game, and there's people who've never played it who are absolutely brilliant coaches. I mean, if you look at, let's be honest, people like Mourinho, Wenger, that haven't been top players. I could go through a few other names, but haven't been top players, but yet have been absolutely world-class managers. So I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to it. I think either way, you have to show commitment. You're not going to get anything easily as a coach. Just because you've been a player, just because you played at a top level or whatever that is, just because you've had a career spanning over X games, that means the second you start doing a session, I always felt the same way. It means absolutely nothing. You're now judged on how good that session is and how much people have enjoyed it and how much they've learned. So for me, there's no perfect route. I think there's so many different routes into the game, which I think is brilliant. I think it makes it very difficult to go and get those jobs and have longevity in the game. I mean, we've always spoke about that, haven't we, actually? For people like us that have had longevity in the game, you're honoured, really. It's like it's a real compliment, obviously, to some element of quality to your work. I know not every club would potentially agree with that, having had us as their manager, but it shows a level of consistency, doesn't it? Do you know what I mean? Which is not easy to find. So yeah, I think the young coach going in, there's definitely obvious routes to do that. I also think you have to support that with some of the science. I think you could probably give a better answer to that, but understanding team dynamics, understanding how people learn, understanding the physiology, understanding that performance side, and how, if you look now, being a coach now is about, interpreting data. It's about working with an analysis department. It's about understanding training loads and all of those things. You haven't got to be an expert, but you've got to at least have a good understanding of it. So, how important is that, do you think, or how tough is that for a player to suddenly then pivot and not just think about the workload and what goes into it, but actually start to understand some pretty tricky scientific work that underpins, a footballing week?
Well, it's great that coaches or players now are very computer literate. So it's not that they're suddenly being presented with a computer and they don't know how to even turn it on, and definitely going back to when I started, some of my first trips on the team coach, and I had a laptop and it was the only piece of technology that was on the bus apart from the 14-inch TV that was playing, whatever the film was on that had been bought from the
Only Fools and Horses. It's got to be Only Fools and Horses, surely.
Something like that,
So like
that was the technology then. Everybody's got a computer now in the bus, we moved away even from where players used to have gaming stations on the coaches. Now they've all got computers. They're computer literate, so they need to know about the software that we're going to use. They need to know about the different types of solutions that are out there, be they understanding GPS or any of those kind of physical things that we use with the players, the scouting software, the planning software, the analysis software. You have to be competent on all of that stuff. You can't just come in and decide that you're going to bring in a pen and a pad, or something like iDrill's a great app that you can use to design all of your.
Who designed that, Dave? I've got no idea.
But all of that stuff now is at the end of a player's fingertips to be able to gain knowledge, be able to understand things an awful lot better. The resources are out there on the internet to really accelerate your learning nowadays. You don't have to, necessarily go off and do observational trips to other clubs, although they are still hugely beneficial. But I remember young coaches having to go off for a week's visit to a club to try and observe as much as they could. Whereas, in the space of a few hours now on the internet, you can have gained probably 3 times the amount of information and drills and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that's one side to it, which is if you want to work with the tech and do your analysis and all of your planning, that's one side. That's the non-human side, isn't it? And the computer never says anything back to you. It might freeze, but it never complains. The problem is when you're on the grass and they start complaining and they start, what players are like. They start questioning whether your session's really good. When they go back into the dressing room, your session's getting critiqued. Just like every player, when they come out in the morning, they look on the grass, they see what the setup is, and they're already planning whether today is a good day or not a good day for them.
Which I think is why it's important to have that variety and treat it in a very professional way. Part of your challenge is how good can you be? Don't just be average if you're a player. Some players at that point might just be trying to get by. and I understand that. But that's your challenge, and that's how you create a good reputation in the game, because people see your work and see maybe that variety or the quality of your sessions, or, and you don't get and also how you deal with people. That's a big thing, isn't it? When you're coaching, particularly at senior level, the second you start that session, if somebody's not doing it properly, in terms of the tempo, the intensity, or the quality, or the attitude, sometimes you have to be strong enough to be able to see that and step in and deal with it. And that gains you a little bit of respect sometimes. You have to do it in the right way. If you do it in the wrong way, that might work the other way, and that might make people switch off from your session. So I think, again, all these things are skill sets that you've got to find the sweet spot that works for you, not necessarily works for everyone else. I think you're right in as much as, there's so much information out there now. I mean, if I was a young coach, I would be absolutely enthralled by the amount of sessions you can see, the amount of work you can see other clubs doing. Literally, I would be on the internet all day trying to writing sessions down, understanding out why they're doing them, how does that fit into the team's game model, how does that fit into the club's culture and everything. So I think there is so much available, but it doesn't, like you very rightly said, in some ways, it doesn't replace the feeling of, we go back to that feeling again, don't we? How do you deal with that first session? I think to a certain degree, I can tell instantly within that first session, within that first 30 seconds, whether that person's got a future in coaching. And often it can be, if something goes wrong, how do they deal with it? We've all done it. We've all done a session, and suddenly, you do a passing drill with stations, and suddenly there's nobody on one of the stations, and you haven't actually worked it out properly. And at that point, you can go, all right, lads, let's send us a test for you. Work it out yourselves and just pray that they can come up with a solution so it doesn't look like you haven't. But the point is, you have to think on your feet at that point. You have to try and, show authenticity. Even if it's going wrong, you have to keep you calm and keep control. And I think they're all great traits for people, but 100%, you don't know what's going to happen until you step onto a pitch. But it's an exciting world out there for a young coach or for a player that wants to be a coach, because there's great opportunity. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of clubs with a lot of staff. But, compared to when we first started, there's so many more avenues and there's so much support with that, isn't there?
Well, yeah, you look at the different kind of job options now. It's no longer just head coach, assistant head coach, and first team coach. You can be a specialist coach, whether you want to work with strikers or defenders or whoever, an individual coach. You can be a set play coach. So the options are there for people who want to get into that kind of anywhere around supporting the players with learning and development, be that in the academy, be that at a first team level. I think the options now for players are even greater than they ever were, but it still doesn't give them the almost the right to just think that it's going to be easy and that it's just a natural path that they should just be offered. They have to work towards it, and they need to take the necessary steps along the way. And certainly if they're in their mid-20s, they probably need to start thinking about, well, is this something that might interest me in the next 5-10 years? Obviously, top-end professional players are so busy with games and things like that they're probably not thinking too much about it. But as you get towards the 30s or early 30s, then minds start shifting to the next stage, don't they? So, a tough transition for any player. But I'm sure once they get into it, they'll enjoy it. You certainly did.
Absolutely. Hey, listen, it's a great career. It's a great, I always say the same thing. If it's like anything, isn't it? If you do something you absolutely love and enjoy, and it's almost like a hobby, it isn't really working, is it? So it's an absolute pleasure to be in that environment. So it's a great environment, but I think you have to be serious about it. And I think especially nowadays, there's so many people wanting to do it. There's so few opportunities in some ways. You have to have the quality. And I think that's down to any job, isn't it? How much are you prepared? How dedicated are you to learn your craft and not just think, I'm an ex-player, I'll be able to just do it. It doesn't work like that. So, yeah, exciting times out there for young coaches. It's a pleasure to see some of them coming through, actually, because as you get a bit older, I'm sure you're the same, where a lot of players that I've coached are now starting to coach themselves. So, yeah, showing my age, but yeah, it's really interesting to see, but tough transition.
Yeah, as my wife said, just because you've been a student doesn't mean you can be the teacher, does it? You know, we've all been in the classroom. It doesn't mean we're going to stand in front of the classroom and teach people. We have to learn how to teach. So, yeah, great observation, you know, and certainly if any people out there who are thinking of becoming coaches, whether they're former players, send some comments in below, and you know, maybe we'll get back to you and, you know, answer any questions that you might have, and we'll always try and reply to those. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube or listening on your podcast provider. It helps with the old algorithm to keep pushing us up on the charts. So thanks for that one, Gary. Another good conversation, that one.
Cheers, Dave.